I'm Molly Stone, the Artistic Director at Catamount Arts, and I'm here with Katherine and Kata today. And I wanted to welcome Katherine, our Outgoing Gallery Director at Catamount Arts, and say thank you for all of her work over the years. And I want to hand it over to Katherine to do this interview with Kata, and welcome you both to the Zoom room. So thank you for being here.
Oh, Molly, thanks for having us. Kata, I am so pleased to be working with you on this, and I'm thrilled that you're actually in your studio so we can see some of your works in progress. The show at Catamount looks great. It's primarily focused on climate change, your feelings about climate change, but this is work that is, rich and, very complex because it doesn't, you're working in an abstract mode. Can you talk about, how you first became interested in this project? It's been ongoing for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it has been ongoing for a long time, and it's sort of there was no like aha moment that it just suddenly came into being. It kind of gradually evolved over time. I've always been really interested in water, and I paint water a lot in a variety of forms. And I just, the climate situation, I read about it a lot. I think about it a lot. I'm fascinated by ice and the changes. There's often things in the news about what's happening at the poles, but also what's happening all over the planet. And it's not just local. It's literally happening on a global scale. So it just started seeping into my work. And I work in mixed media. I always start out drawing in pencils, ink, different kinds of paint, sometimes pastels, chalks, you name it. I just noticed that this was an issue that kept kind of creeping into the subject matter, and sometimes not even with my, I don't always work with a particular subject in mind. I just start working, and then things present themselves as I go along. It's very process based. So it kind of it felt like a kind of like a dialogue between the materials and the colors and the textures and the subject matter and me. And sometimes it's really interesting because sometimes I try to push a particular narrative, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it really doesn't work.
Yeah.
And other times the piece will tell me what it's about. I'll think it's about X, and it turns out to be about Y. So
was that what you thought when you started? So those long sort of core pieces that that I think we've talked about reference, the core samples that geologists will take of ice to kind of determine what's happening and where we're going and what happened in the past. When did you start? So when did you start doing those? Because looking at them, when I first saw them, I thought, oh, this is a really interesting color study, and then it became really clear that they're not just color studies, but you're using all kinds of colors to kind of reference different strata of time as you're going down. Is that right? Or am I interpreting that correctly?
It is and it isn't. I mean, it's not literal. It's very,
no, nothing's literal. It's very
kind of metaphorical.
yeah,
so,
and associative. It's
and yeah. So but it probably started, oh gosh. Oh, I can't pin a year. I'd have to look at my notes, at my lists of some of vertical pieces. I know that I drove my then framer crazy because I wanted these really long, skinny pieces. And the first ones were, 48 inches, 66 inches. I mean, they were really long and skinny, and it's a bit of a challenge to get a wooden structure to be solid and not torque,
stable and not torque, and
or warp or things like that. So
Yeah.
I've had a few trials and errors, but it does lend itself to me. There's something about the idea of that nature doesn't lie. We humans can bend the truth,
Yeah.
but nature, the evidence is there. I suppose it can be interpreted different ways,
Yeah.
but depending on what you're looking at and what you're looking for, there are different layers and levels and patterns of things that will indicate specific situations. And I just find it really, to me, part of the intrigue is that there's the natural, what's happening in the natural world, and then there's how human beings want to interpret it or pay attention to it. And there's so many things that come into play.
Or not pay attention to it.
Or not pay attention to it, but it's
Yeah.
usually moneyed interests and governments and political issues and industry and so on and so forth. But at the same time, look what's happening. I mean, things are happening around the globe. Irrefutable. There are parts of the world where the water levels are rising to a substantial it's not just an era in judgment or something. It's really happening. People's lives are affected.
So what you're doing is associative, and the surfaces are so sensual and rich. Sometimes you're using caustic, you're using different media. The watercolors that you've done, they're delicate, but you're approaching something that's not a delicate issue. Can you talk to that a little bit, or am I going off track too much?
No. It's lovely to hear you talk, describe it that way, because I guess most of the time I'm just making it or doing it, and I'm not really.
That's your job, right?
I'm not thinking about all the nice things that you've just said. I'm more, when I'm actually painting, standing and painting these, it's more about the relationship of colors and textures and patterns and so on, and what works and what doesn't work, or what, and that can change literally from day to day, which can be really frustrating, actually, because one day I think, that's it, I've got it, and the next day it's like, what was I thinking? That's just just not it at all, or things shift. So I'm really intrigued by the shifts that are happening in nature and the shifts that are happening in the actual process of making something, and the levels of awareness and acceptance. And sometimes I just have to walk away and let a piece tell me when it's to back off.
Right. When you said,
fortunately, I'll keep going almost forever. So.
Well, I find that wonderful. But when you talked about doing drawings in preparation, or you said you start out with drawings. So for these core samples, how do you kind of begin a study in a drawing that takes you to these, variations in colors of drilling into ice?
They usually start out a good deal larger, and they're a different kind of drawing, and then I'll cut them up and
really? Okay.
They never start out as the long skinny vertical pieces, interestingly enough. I mean, every once in a while I have the pieces that start out that way don't seem to go as far. I can't tell you why, but when I just start out with a larger sheet of paper, I work on paper most of the time.
And then the paper is affixed to the wood.
And then I cut it into pieces and arrange the panels in whatever way they, depending on the specific piece, whether they're very, geometric shapes or much more loosely configured. So, and I do go back and forth between you can see some of these behind me, the vertical panels, and more figurative pieces that are maybe a little more clearly referencing water, ice, melting, temperatures rising. And it's not just water and ice, it's also, things like high temperatures, fires. Having experienced, I've visited over the pre-pandemic and actually last year during COVID, have visited out west, and it's extraordinary what's going on and starting now. From
Really
the
hot.
spring to the winter, the wildfires are just a given. They're not maybe anymore. They're every year is a fire year. So
yeah,
that's
and some of those vertical panels, you're not just using cool blues and greens. You've got very hot. Is that what you're referencing? Or I was taking them as core samples of, volcanic core samples, or, sort of into the earth.
But kind of often both. Yeah, some of them are referencing the earth, the temperature, people's awareness, whether we choose to turn a blind eye, whether we even talk about it, whether it's a subject that anybody's. I think, we're fairly self-absorbed as a species. So if it's affecting us, it somehow, and how we live or what our economic situation is, or then we pay a different kind of attention to whether it's just some kind of abstract concept out there somewhere that we read about. So
yeah.
So experiencing it, I mean, I'd love to travel more again. I'm hoping that if the pandemic settles down, I'll get to go to some of the places that I'd really like to see in person.
Where would those be? Greenland, Iceland?
I would love to go to Greenland and Iceland and the Arctic. We had a trip planned to Labrador a few years ago. And I'm sure we would have seen ice because there's this corridor where the icebergs flow down. This is we were going to be there in the summer, and the icebergs flow down during the summer weather, and they, get kind of backed up in certain areas between Labrador and Newfoundland. And but the boat we were going to be on had a serious mishap, so I always feel like I never know exactly what to say about these pieces because they tend to surprise me often. And I do this is probably not a good thing, but I sometimes keep tinkering with them in ways that sometimes they jump to another level and other times they don't. So it really is a process, and I'm delighted to hear what you said, Molly, about sitting in the room with them, because I sit in the studio with them often, and they do kind of, there's like this cross dialogue that's going on sometimes, which is really fun. And I personally, I don't know if this is, I don't know what this is, but I like the abstract work with the figurative work together, because to me they really complement each other. It's not just one or it always feels awful to me to just have one and not the other, because they really, to me, belong together. And
the piece
iceberg stuff is so there's the metaphor of the iceberg to me is such an amazing one, because you see the part above the surface, that's what we see, but there's this huge volume underneath the surface that is also there, that we tend to completely be unaware of.
Kata, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and letting us see your studio. And Molly, thank you so much for facilitating this. And I guess this is my last show at Catamount, but it's been a good one, and I'm really pleased to spend this time with you. So
thank you both.
Yeah, and thank you, Katherine, for all of your years as gallery director at Catamount.